Welcome Dr. Melissa Finucane. She's going to be talking to us about communicating environmental health risks, why science, emotion, and values are important. Welcome, Dr. Finucane.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chris and Missy, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. And I'm sorry I missed yesterday. It sounds like you had some interesting discussions, and I have loved to have been here. But I'm very happy to be here today. I am a psychologist by training, but really focus on decision science. I'm the director for the the Consortium for Resilient Gulf Communities, which is a GOMRI-funded consortium, and also a senior behavioral and social scientist at RAND Gulf States Policy Institute. So a lot of my work over the last couple of decades has been about behavioral decision making, how people perceive risk or make judgments and decisions about risk issues from the kind of social, cultural, psychological perspective. So I thought I would talk to you today about some of that research, just to give you a deeper understanding of some of these factors that affect perceptions of risk, because it has a lot of implications for how you then might communicate about risk in different contexts or with different audiences, and very much less so during a presentation on risk communication that says, establish trust, make sure your messages are clear and concise, and the things that I'm sure many of you have probably much experience in the real world, but also could give those kinds of presentations much more ably than I. But feel free to jump in with questions, comments, anything along the way. So what we know is that essentially this field was established because of some stalemates that were occurring regularly many years ago and still occur to this day, between the scientific or technocratic community on the one hand and lay communities on the other. And over the years, I think we've really improved our understanding of how people process risk information, but nonetheless, core challenges remain. And it's really crystallized in the repeated observations that the scientists and technocrats, regulators, are often frustrated by what they perceive to be either uneducated or ill-informed lay community groups. But on the other hand, we have frustrated communities that think scientists and regulators are missing the point and focusing on the wrong aspects of risk, or the wrong risks, period. So I think by sharing with you what we've learned from some of the both experimental lab work, but also real-world research and practice that's been distilled over the years, we can get a better sense of how people make decisions about risk, particularly under conditions of great uncertainty, and sometimes when that uncertainty can't be reduced. So if you think about it, we literally make hundreds of decisions every day about risk. We decide what to eat for breakfast, what medicines to take, when it's safe to cross a road or not, whether our transport is safe, whether we should go to a public hearing about a zoning change, whether we should insist on stronger regulations or ask for weaker regulations about something. And for the most part, we make pretty successful decisions. We navigate our way through a very complex world. But sometimes we do see spectacular mistakes that have large consequences for our lives, our communities, and the socioeconomic context in which we're trying to operate. So I've been interested in what drives people to really pay attention to some information, like Oprah, or neglect other information, like my peer-reviewed papers. Why a group like Sea Grant is really good at translating some of that really complicated science to something that makes sense to the user communities that they're very familiar with. And is it actually about the communication process, or is it about other things related to the relationships that they're building? So I don't need to tell you that understanding risk perceptions, risk judgments, and how we communicate risk is really practical importance. When I think about the risk debates and the discourse that goes on about oil spills, either how to prevent them or manage them or clean up after them, about preparing communities for natural disasters like hurricanes, especially in this region, or other environmental and health threats, there's usually a wide variety of views and values being expressed. And so I think understanding risk and risk perceptions can really help us articulate any gaps that we see between the different stakeholder views and values. It helps to facilitate those risk debates and communications and the discourse that's very necessary for us to reduce the big gap in understanding, but also facilitate the effectiveness of the strategies that we have to communicate about what we know and what we think people should be paying attention to. Hopefully this will improve decision processes and outcomes. And just at a really high level, broad perspective, I think really understanding these different perspectives and the different more qualitative drivers of risk can help us reduce conflict locally, regionally, even globally, if we're talking about risk in a way that allows for legitimate stakeholder expressions and differences in their expressions of concerns or priorities with regard to the uptake of new technologies, which may come with great benefits, but also risk, but also the management of natural hazards. For the academic or more geek-oriented folks interested in theory, a lot of this work came from economic theory and of course technical risk analysis, which have been around for a long time. The field of behavioral decision research only really got established in the 70s. And as I mentioned, it was because of these real-world conflicts or challenges. But it's been important to develop a good theoretical understanding because by describing the judgment decision-making processes that lay people especially engage in, or the differences between lay and scientific perspectives, it helps us understand the differences, the processes, the various variables that are involved and how they're related so that we can predict what we think might happen. And I'll show you some examples of being able to anticipate when people are likely to overestimate or underestimate risk and what you might find, what the implication might be for how we design our risk communication strategies. So just to give you a very easy mental model, if you will, of how I like to think about the myriad factors that we could study, that we've learned from a lot of research that affect judgments of risk or decisions about risky options. I think there are three main categories of variables that are important. One set has to do with characteristics of the decision maker, and so these are just background demographic characteristics. It might be your tendency to prefer holistic or analytic thinking. It might be the experience that you bring. It might be the educational background or the training that you have that gives you a certain perspective. Lots of people have looked at numeracy and health literacy and all kinds of cognitive or other experiential qualities of decision makers. On the left, there are also characteristics of the task. Some tasks are just much more complex, require a digestion of more technical information. We're more familiar with some information, for instance, about smoking or about airplane travel than we might be with the fate and transport of oil or dispersant use and so on. There's some types of information that's very affectively engaging. Emotionally, it really gets people's attention. And there are good psychological reasons for that. It helps us figure out, do I need to, basically, do I run away from this tiger or do I stand and fight? Do I want to be taking this on or is it in my best interest to hightail it and figure out an alternate approach later? So we'll talk a little bit about task characteristics, and then on the right there we have the context characteristics. So if you think about it, sometimes we have plenty of time to look at the toxicology reports, to digest all the science, and really be very deliberative in our analysis and our processing of the information. Other times, there's great time pressure. There's no decision support tools, modeling, etc., around available for us, and you have to make quick decisions. So under different contexts, different time pressure, decision support, and so on, we can do things differently. And the reason all these things are important is because it can really change the judgment about whether something's risky or not, and as a consequence, what we choose to do about it. So let's do a little walk through history. This is one of the very earliest risk perception studies done by my colleagues Sarah Lichtenstein and Paul Slovic and others at Decision Research. And the basic finding here is that lay people tend to underestimate some risks and overestimate others. So basically there's a systematic misestimation of risk. So in this particular task, they told people that motor vehicles kill about 50,000 people annually in the US, and then they said for 40 other hazards, give us a fatality estimate. And then they plotted it on this graph. And you can see that things like dying from tornadoes or from pregnancy or a flood are typically overestimated. They're very dramatic causes of death. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of the figure there, things like asthma, heart failure, stomach cancer, diabetes, these are things that actually we're very familiar with people living in non-fatal forms, so they don't really have the same attention-grabbing effect, and we tend to think that they're not quite as risky as perhaps our public health officials would like us to understand. This is one of the landmark studies in the field of risk perception by Paul Slovic in the mid to late 80s. They asked folks to rate 81 different hazardous activities and technologies on a whole bunch of qualitative scales. And the basic finding here is that they found two main factors drive perceptions of risk. So in comparison to more technical, like a toxicology approach or engineering approach, where so-called objective indices are very important, fatality rates, so mortality or morbidity estimates, what this study was showing was that lay people or even experts outside of their own fields tend to judge risks based on other qualitative dimensions, and it boils down to the extent to which something's unknown, so that's called the unknown risk dimension, and the extent to which is dreaded, so the dread risk dimension. These are bipolar, so something, so if you look in the bottom left of this chart, these are things that are pretty well known to people and not really perceived as dreaded. So power motors, I think bridges, pedestrian bridges are in there, motorcycles, bicycles. These things do not, so the size of the dot there is the judged risk of the activity. Where you see the biggest dots, the top right-hand quadrant, these are things that are seen as really dreaded, so they have potentially fatal consequences, they have a threat to future generations, they're seen as involuntarily imposed, or the risks and benefits are distributed inequitably. These are the things like radioactive waste, anything to do with nuclear power, and fossil fuel. This is done in the 80s, so that some of these things may have changed in their positioning, but that's the bottom line here. So all those things in the top right-hand quadrant, or even if they're not listed there right now, if you feel like something has these qualities of being unknown or dreaded, it's most likely that the perceptions of risk are going to be high, and that demand for regulation will be high. There'll be a lot of media attention. So where something is in this kind of space can help you predict what kind of reactions you'll have to deal with as a communicator or a planner or policymaker. So at the risk of being a little provocative, I wanted to walk through some of the research on gender and race. Partly because I think it illustrates the complexity of perceptions of risk and the importance of these sociocultural characteristics of people. So over many years, decades of research now has shown that in general, risks tend to be judged as lower by men than by women. So for instance, compared with men, women typically are more opposed to nuclear power, war. They find it more unacceptable and threatening, for instance, to live near an estate that might have polluted soil, or near a chemical plant, or in the vicinity of a site that's proposed for storage of, say, radioactive waste. For a long time, it's been hard to understand these gender differences, and to a large extent, the role of race also in perceived risk, because these two characteristics co-vary with a lot of other socio-political factors, like attitudes towards government, regulatory processes, distribution of power and wealth. So the main aim of our research over the years has really been to try and isolate and understand how gender and race are related to these factors and thought to influence risk perceptions. And the bottom line here, if you remember nothing else, is that I think we can dismiss the notion that heterogeneous views are not clearly divided along male, female, or white, non-white lines. And I'll explain why in the next couple of charts. So traditionally, one explanation for gender differences in risk perceptions is based on an assumption of differences in rationality and education. So I alluded to this earlier, that according to the irrationality perspective, risk perceptions that deviate from those more objective indices or measures like fatality rates are thought to arise from a lack of understanding of complex scientific and technical information. But empirical research doesn't support this. So this figure is what we call a tornado graph. This is from data from toxicologists in Britain and Canada, all of whom are well-trained in risk analysis procedures. So we can assume they have the technical background and understanding of risk and assessment procedures. And in this study, they were just asked to rate a whole range of different hazards on a 4-point scale from not at all risky to high risk to society. And what we see here is the difference between men and women in the percentage of folks that gave moderate or high risk responses for each hazard. And you can see that all the differences are to the right of the 0% mark, indicating, well, nearly all of them, indicating that the percentage of females compared with males that gave moderate and high risk responses is greater. So I think we can dispense with the irrationality argument because these are all highly trained people and we still find the gender differences. A second common explanation for gender differences in risk perception is often based on biological differences. So for instance, women are characterized as being more concerned about health and safety because we're inherently programmed to give birth, to nurture life, and maintain life. Or we could be physically characterized as being physically more vulnerable and therefore more concerned about threats, for instance, from rape or other health and life-threatening events. So there are these biological explanations for gender differences based on certain inherent or assumed inherent tendencies. But I think we can at least decrease the salience of this explanation. Apart from research like this is data from a national survey in the US where folks were asked to rate, this is just a subset of the data, they were actually asked to rate a whole range of different risks, again on that 4-point scale. And this figure shows the mean risk ratings of white males, white females, non-white males, and non-white females in the left panel there. And you can see in that left panel that line with the open squares on the left-hand side is the white male group. And their risk perception ratings are consistently much lower than the other 3 groups. You also see that non-white males and non-white females are more similar in their risk perceptions to each other than are white males and females. So a biological explanation for gender differences would require that the differences in male versus female risk perceptions would transcend racial boundaries, which is clearly not what we see here. And in a way, and I should also add that we control for a lot of socio-demographic characteristics and other things that we know are correlated with these categorizations. But in a way, it's unfortunate that this became known as the white male effect. If you Google it, you'll see a lot of research has been done on this. Because I think what's most important is the later research that really looked at the role of worldviews and values that different people have, and they tend to coalesce along in terms of these categories. But we've learned a lot more from understanding in detail what worldviews, values, trust issues, stigma potential are on people's minds. And I think that's more important for risk communication strategies. So let me talk a little bit more about that. So in subsequent work, we have explored whether risk perceptions reflect these deep-seated values about technology or risk more broadly and its impacts on society. That is, we're thinking, or our hypothesis was that differences in risk perceptions are really due to people's worldviews and values. That is, their general attitudes about how the world should be organized, especially with respect to social organization and by association regulatory processes, how decisions are made about what's safe and what's not. What that trade-off is between, well, we're willing to accept some risk for the benefit, but at what point do we say it's an unacceptable risk? So consistent with something called cultural theory, we found that compared with others, white males were more likely to express hierarchical views. So for instance, they'd agree with a statement such as, when a risk is very small, it's okay for society to impose that risk on individuals without their consent. They were also more likely to disagree with egalitarian statements. For instance, to disagree that what the world needs more is an equal distribution of wealth. And they're also more likely to disagree with statements about the community being a trustworthy partner in making good decisions. For instance, they disagree with a statement such as, people living near a nuclear power plant should be able to vote to close the plant if they think it's not being run safely. So I think this was a good step towards really thinking harder about the views and values that people are bringing, and subsequent research really looked at variation within these groups to determine the extent to which you could just use race or gender as a proxy for these values. And the bottom line is, it's much more complicated. I think it's important to recognize that within white males, there are folks that are all across the board. It depends on the context. If you remember my person task fit framework, depends on the context as to which views and values seem more salient at the time, what's used to make these judgments and decisions, what information you have or time you have available, decision support systems, and so on. I think the bottom line in terms of policy, Okay, so the last point there is vulnerability, control, and benefits vary within groups. So regardless of gender or race, if you're someone who's creating a risk, so if you're in charge of making the thing, the technology, or a mitigating strategy like the bridge or the technology to keep people safe, if you benefit from that, if you have control over it, your perceptions of risk are much lower than other folks. Different worldviews matter. The reason this is important for policy is it affects very strongly the extent to which different safety standards and decision processes will be supported. So for instance, folks that are more hierarchical in their perspectives feel that the complexity of some technologies like bioengineered technology or genetic information really undermines their own ability to make informed personal decisions. So they prefer mechanisms that draw on the expertise of other people rather than relying on what they know is their own incomplete knowledge. On the other hand, egalitarians have a strong desire to have all the information provided to them so they can make their own personal choices in the marketplace. So they want the choice to be able to do the risk assessment based on the information given to them, but also based on their own beliefs and preferences about a wide range of technical and non-technical issues. Interestingly, or not surprisingly, everyone wants to be involved in decision-making in some way, but these worldviews that people come with, or that are more or less salient in different contexts, suggest that there are different extents to which people might be willing, say, to trust the judgment of others. For some consumers, they're willing to trust someone else to make decisions about safety standards, whereas others would extend that trust to include judgments about ethical considerations or moral decisions about what should even be available on the market. So just a few comments about other aspects beyond just individual characteristics that affect perceptions and judgments of risk. Place is important, trust is important, and agency is important. I'm most familiar with air pollution research in this area. There's a good article by Bickerstaff, 2004, which really explores how risk perceptions are embedded in issues of place and identity. And Liesl Ritchie and many others who've been studying oil spills for a long time have a lot to say about the sociological processes that are very important. I think there's a wide range of sociocultural studies that stress the importance of the everyday experience that people have, that they bring to understanding their experience of risk and the extent to which they believe it's risky or beneficial to them. For instance, seeing soot in the air or on your furniture, or seeing a plume of fumes emitted from some source, and either knowing or not knowing what is in there, really transgresses some people's sense of safety or their personal safe place. Smells, physiological effects are also important because they give you these experiential cues And that's a source of information for a lot of people in judging risk. Bickerstaff talked also about the lack of spontaneous expressions of concern, in particular with air pollution. And in part you could understand this because if people are very committed to a certain location or community, they have a strong sense of community, they don't want to connect the air pollution, for instance, with their local community. They want to avoid any stigmatization that might negatively impact their cultural and social commitments. So I said agency is important also. Collective agency refers to the power or the status, the alienation of a community. Wealthier communities, for instance, often feel that poor health from pollution in poorer communities that might be living closer to industrial sites is not anything that they can do something about. So there's this dissociation strategy that affects people's motivation to act and do something differently because they feel that they can't do something meaningfully across space or across, whether it's a geographic space or community can be defined in a number of different ways. Trust is important. There's so much written about trust and a lot of real-world experience certainly has emphasized, Sea Grant has built a reputation of having these very trusted relationships with a whole range of different users of the science that we generate in different communities. I think the sense of agency that I talked about is connected with this sense of, or concerns about trustworthiness, especially of controlling regulatory institutions, whether you're from the Coast Guard and you're seen as an authority that comes in with certain rules and regs, or an academic scientist who doesn't have regulatory power, but you might have power on a committee to, that's making decisions about safety standards or making recommendations about different types of policies. Increasingly, we see distrust of different groups. Academics used to be relatively trustworthy or perceived or rated that way. Increasingly, there's more concern about the agendas of different groups, whether you're academic, or federal employee, or other business. Obviously, businesses are particularly seen as having certain agendas. By definition, they're serving their stakeholders. So, as a consequence, information can really be difficult for people to interpret because they're thinking about all these other issues related to where the information has come from and how trustworthy it is. And I think that the net result is that information often bears little relationship to people's encounters with or cultural understanding of the issue, whether it's oil spills, air pollution, or others. So the information is dismissed as irrelevant, even though there might be a lot of really useful information being provided by government agencies or others. Two key findings from much research on risk. One is that it's really hard to build up. It's very asymmetrical. It takes a long time to build risk and a very short time to to build trust and a very short time to break trust. The other is that problems with trust cannot be overcome just by improving the quality of risk communication materials. The types of products that Sea Grant and others generate are very important for providing information in an easy to digest way from a cognitive perspective, but it's not a substitute, it's not sufficient because you cannot separate perceptions of risk and judgments about risk from the social landscape that we're embedded in. So I've talked a lot about experiential information or experiences being important sources of information, and the reason that this is important is because we have both this capacity for analysis and deliberation as well as an experiential system, both of which are critical for survival, because you don't want to have to decide, when you're about to cross the road, what is the velocity of that oncoming vehicle? And if I leave at this point, what is the trajectory of my body if I get slammed? You just make a quick intuitive decision, do I go or not go? Otherwise we'd be stuck in analysis paralysis all day. So both systems are important, and their use differs depending on the context, the various variables that we talk about. I'm not going to talk about narrative right now. Let me just say a couple of words about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and other information that you can access about communication about oil spills. Obviously, I've talked a lot about the Sea Grant, especially the government-funded Sea Grant work. It's stellar and amazing, and so many modalities, and a really great example of good risk communication. There are a ton of papers and reports. We have them on our website if you're interested in looking for more information in a written form. Lots of local government and non-government organizations have worked tirelessly with their communities in the ways that they know their communities need to receive information, whether that's a language translation issue or just a prioritization of what does this risk mean to you in the context of dealing with your diabetes or your health, other heart conditions or your employment challenges, etc. And of course, there was a ton of research done already on risk communication from other oil spills, such as Exxon Valdez, which continues to this day. So lessons from Deepwater Horizon, I think in short, public engagement actually was much greater during and after Deepwater Horizon than previously, in part because of the increased availability of information through social media, especially, and the conversations that happen much more rapidly than we have had to deal with traditionally. I think there are still unaddressed concerns, especially around dispersant use and people's understanding of what's in dispersants, where do they go, what do they do exactly. I think there is a lot of situation-specific information that is intended to empower people, but at the same time there's so much information that it's hard to manage and it's hard to interpret for local communities to know what applies to my particular circumstances. I think we could do a lot more in involving communities in advance of the next major oil spill, much more community engagement and participation in preparedness and understanding how they can prepare, but also how they can respond when something happens. And then I'll also recommend you to a paper by Anne Hayward-Walker, Ann Bostrom, and some other great researchers who focus specifically on risk communication about oil spills. Some recommendations that they have based on the Deepwater Horizon situation. So finally, just to wrap up, priority steps moving forward. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of building resilient communities in different, diverse ways. Because I think if we have more resilient communities in advance of the next oil spill, we'll be in a much better position to help communities navigate the shock to the socioeconomic and the cultural and the geographic environment that they're in, and also perhaps improve things consequently. I think we need to do more to establish and improve and sustain relationships, especially with respect to trust. I talked about engaging local stakeholders. I think we really need to perhaps do a better job in grounding our efforts in local sociocultural context and really understanding what that means. And that means involving, the city above point, involve local people from the outset so that they can bring their knowledge to the table that we, as outsiders or as regulators or researchers, just don't have that perspective. And then finally, evaluation. I am a huge proponent of testing messages before they go out, but also evaluating and reflecting on how did we do and learning from our mistakes, because nothing's perfect. And sometimes that's where we get the most information from. I believe, yes. So I'm happy to take questions, comments.
So Melissa will be on our panel later on, but if you have any pressing questions right now you want to ask, please go right ahead.
So I was curious, one of the things that occurred to me was between this sort of the cognitive behavioral risk perception stuff, and you make some little in-group, out-group, kind of tribalism. You must understand 2018 politics perfectly. Unknown
and dread risk dimensions pop out repeatedly in that context. And again, the worldviews and values seem more relevant when trying to explain any differences in perceptions. But yeah, it's limited to first world context by and large.
Yes.
Listen, really interesting presentation, and I have heard, but not in the detail you provided, some of these gender and race and demographic characterizations with risk, the economics would call it risk loving versus risk averse. But what on the other end of the spectrum are the risk averse characteristics for those gender, race, demographic? You had to sort of describe the most risk averse population. Who would that be? The polar opposite, I guess, of white males per your slide.
I think the folks that are in positions of less power, who are more vulnerable to suffering adverse consequences from the risk, or have less resources available to them to recover from or deal and address a risk event that occurs to them. So typically you might think about Black women or minority women more broadly. Again, it depends on the context. So, I lived in Hawaii a long time, and the ethnic breakdown there is very different, and white people actually are a minority group. So I would say, white women in that context actually have a lot less power and more negative impact. So it depends on the culture, but in general, it's that vulnerability that really is the essence. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.